Hello, hello. Welcome to the Cotswolds. That's where I am. I don't know where all of you are. I suspect a lot of you are in the States, as well as the UK here. For those of you who are in the UK, it's very warm, and I hope you've got a nice glass of water or maybe a glass of wine, because it's that time of day. This is Viking Cruises Greek Week, and I'm very, very honored and flattered to have been asked to give this lecture to inaugurate Greek Week. I should point out that this year, 2021, is also the anniversary, the 200th anniversary of the start of the Greek War of Independence, which happened in 1821. So those of you who will be going to Greece this year, whether on a cruise or just on your own, do be aware that there are lots of museum exhibitions, there are lots of things going on in Athens and around the country to celebrate the anniversary. So it's a good year, it's a very good year to get there. Okay, the Acropolis, the Parthenon. Let's start. Here we go. There it is, the Parthenon. It's been there for about 2,500 years. And when Pericles and the city council dedicated it in 438 BC, they probably thought that it was going to last forever. And of course, they are right in some ways. More than 5 million people pass through the Propylaea every year to see buildings like the Parthenon, the Erechtheion, and the little temple to Athena Nike. And Athena Nike means Athena victorious, right? And all of these are still standing after 2.5 millennia. But I have to say that Pericles was wrong in some other ways, because even a site as iconic as the Athenian Acropolis, even with a site like that, change is inevitable, as you'll see when you go up there. And it's the changes that I want to talk about tonight. At the end of the 5th century BC, the Acropolis looked like this. As you approached, you saw first the little Nike temple, which I show in a blue highlight there. Then you would walk through the Propylaea, the gateway, and see for the first time the Parthenon. And then you would find to the north the Erechtheion and various other temples and building complexes, including the outline of older temples, which you see on this plan. Those would have been there even in the 5th century BC, the foundations. Oh, and I should point out that when you walk through the Propylaea and get your first glimpse of the Parthenon, what you're looking at is the back of it, because Greek temples were orientated usually east-west, like Christian churches, and the entrance was always on the east side, whereas here the Propylaea is on the west. So the iconic view of the Parthenon through the colonnade of the Propylaea is actually the back of the building. Now, at the end of the 5th century BC, the Greek biographer Plutarch, who was writing more than 5 centuries after the buildings were constructed, wrote that they still looked as if they were freshly built. But actually, only about 100 years after the Parthenon was finished, it was already changing. In the 4th century BC, ornate shields were installed on the front, that is the far side of the Parthenon, on the architrave, as a display of sort of war booty. And what you're looking at in this photograph from the 1960s, are the holes for the attachment of the large ornate shields. Those are the large holes, and then the smaller holes are actually much later. They date to AD 61, and they were the attachments for gilded bronze letters for an inscription that was honoring the Emperor Nero. A couple of hundred years after the shields were installed, in the 2nd century BC, there was a monument built at the northeast corner, and I show it in blue on this plan. This structure actually touched the Parthenon, and it was probably an equestrian monument with bronze horses, maybe a chariot, something like that. And it probably commemorated the king of Pergamon. That Pergamon was a kingdom in Asia Minor. Now, this structure, which, as I said, actually touched the building, is the very earliest monument that we know of that was obviously incompatible with the original purpose of the Parthenon as a temple to the goddess Athena. But it wasn't the last, of course, because in 27 BC, the year that Octavian became Augustus, first emperor of Rome, and also the year that Greece became the Roman province of Achaia, a circular temple to Rome and Augustus was built in front of the east end of the Parthenon and directly on its axis, as you can see here. Fortunately, from all indications, the roof of this little building was low enough that it didn't obstruct the sun when it was rising from entering through that main door of the Parthenon and illuminating the golden and ivory statue of Athena that stood inside. And for anyone who has been to Nashville, Tennessee, you'll know that this is the Reconstruction that you can see there. Not long after this, the Romans built a monumental marble staircase to replace the original ramp that led up through the propylaea. This was uncovered in the 19th century, and this photograph was by an American traveler named William James Stillman, dates to 1869. Now, in the 800 years or so between the time the Parthenon was built and the time that the Emperor Theodosius I officially banned the practice of pagan rites at the end of the 4th century AD, there were other repairs up on the Acropolis, usually the result of fires and of earthquakes. And I'm showing you these photographs, which come from the Benaki Museum in Athens, 19th century photographs, just to give you a sense of the sort of destruction that was going on there throughout the life of the Acropolis. The worst of these disasters was probably the fire that was started by the Herulians. The Herulians were an eastern tribe, kind of like the Goths or the Huns, and they probably came from the northern Black Sea area. They invaded the Balkan Peninsula in the 3rd century. They reached Athens in AD 267, and they torched pretty much the entire city, including all the buildings up on the Acropolis. The Parthenon itself was burned so badly that the huge wooden roof rafters fell in, resulting in the collapse of the marble roof. Now, the Parthenon, you have to understand, was a completely marble building, including the roof tiles. All the sculpture on the roof, everything was marble. And it's been estimated that that the roof itself weighed about 350 tons. So when the rafters were burned and the entire thing came down, it caused rather a big bang. In the 1960s, you could still see the heat cracking from the Herulian Fire on some of the columns in the Parthenon, as in this photograph. The inner colonnade, which I show you here in blue in the plan, and then it's the colonnade from Nashville again. This inner colonnade was completely destroyed, and it probably wasn't replaced until about a century later. And fragments of those original columns from that colonnade have been found built into the walls, in the Agora. And eventually a new colonnade was built using reused columns from elsewhere in the city. And this reuse of materials has a very interesting precedent. There was a temple to Athena that is referred to by archaeologists today as the pre-Periclean Parthenon that was under construction on the Acropolis during the Persian Wars in the early part of the 5th century BC. And it was burned to the ground when the Persians sacked the city in 480 BC. Once the Persians left and the Athenians were able to return, they knew that the first thing they had to focus on was renewing the fortifications, because they knew that the Persians would be back, and they were. So what they did was to use the unfinished, half-carved, burnt-out columns and stylobate blocks from the pre-Periclean Parthenon to shore up the fortification walls of the Acropolis. And what you're looking at here on the right are some of those early Parthenon columns, unfinished columns. You can see there are no flutes on them, that are still in the fortification walls of the Acropolis. And on the left, the arrow shows where you can see them. If you stand down in the Agora and look over the little Byzantine church of the Apostles, you can still see where those fortifications were placed in about 479 BC. Once the Persians later on, repairs to the central western door were made with some stones that had been traced to monuments dating from the 5th century BC all the way to the Roman period. So what you have to realize is that, like any building, the buildings on the Acropolis had to be maintained, they had to be repaired, and they suffered damage from various things. And so almost from the beginning, they were changing. Now, moving forward several centuries, pagan religious rites, as I said, probably ended in the Parthenon sometime in the 5th century AD. And the first evidence for the construction of an early Byzantine church within the building dates to about a century later, about the 6th century. And the Erechtheion at roughly the same time was also converted into a church. After 1204, the year that the Crusaders sacked Constantinople, Greece came under the control of a succession of Frankish, that is, Western European rulers. The Parthenon was turned into an archiepiscopal cathedral with an archbishop, and the Propylaea became the bishop's palace. And it was during this phase of life on the Acropolis that the Renaissance traveler Cyriac of Ancona, or Kyriaka d'Ancona, visited Athens. He was there in 1436 and 1444. And he left us the oldest image of the Parthenon that now survives, and that's the image, that's the drawing on the left. In 1458, 5 years after Constantinople had fallen to the Turks and thus ended the Byzantine Empire, the conqueror of Constantinople, whose name was Mehmet II, visited Athens himself. And it's assumed that at about this time, in the mid-15th century, that the church in the Parthenon was converted to a mosque. And the image on the right here shows that mosque within the colonnade of the Parthenon. And it dates to the early 17th century, but it's assumed that nothing much changed between the mid-15th and the early 17th century. The next major event to occur on the Acropolis took place in 1687, and this one was truly devastating. Now, there had been wars between the Ottoman Turks and the European powers for 200 years or so. And the Turks had recently lost the Peloponnese, the southern part of Greece, to Venice, but they still held Athens and northern Greece. In 1687, a council of nobles back in Venice decided that it was time to take Athens. This was despite reservations by Venetians actually on the ground in Greece. Now, by this time, the Erechtheion was being used to house the ruler's harem, and we should probably think of the area up on top of the rock as looking something like this, because in the 17th century, the Acropolis was where the Turks in the city lived. That was the Turkish village, whereas the Christian Greeks lived outside the Acropolis in the area that's now the Agora and on the north side of the rock. Anyway, the Venetians under Francesco Morosini began a bombardment of the Acropolis from ships that were anchored in Piraeus harbor. And on the evening of September 26th, 1687, a shell went through the roof of the mosque, formerly church, formerly Parthenon, and ignited the Turkish gunpowder supplies that had been stored there. Now, the Propylaea had already been a ruin for about 30 years or so, because there had been an explosion in 1656 of a powder magazine that the Turks were keeping in Propylaea, and they don't seem to have learned from that episode, because the Parthenon explosion damaged the building more than it had been since the Herulian sacking 1400 years before. It blew out most of the northern colonnade and pretty much all of the internal walls. So for more than a century after this, the Parthenon was essentially a roofless ruin. It looked a bit like this. There was a small mosque built inside to replace the much bigger one that had been destroyed, but it was essentially a ruin. And then the treasure hunters came. In 1801, Thomas Bruce, Lord Elgin, British ambassador to the Sublime Porte of Sultan Sulim III at Constantinople, petitioned for and received permission from the Turkish authorities to, and I'm quoting here, to take away any pieces of stone with inscriptions or figures thereon. This is what the permit allowed. Now, the wording of this is open to a lot of interpretation, but we won't go into that tonight. So with this permit, Elgin hired a team of laborers to remove the best of the surviving frieze blocks that ran around the tops of the walls and the porches in the Parthenon. And this contemporary watercolor by Edward Dodwell, dating from 1801, the date of the permit that Elgin had, shows Elgin's men actually removing metope blocks from the surviving Parthenon. Now, whatever your view of Elgin's right or not to take the sculptures, in order to remove the roughly 27 meters of frieze that they extracted, the workmen also had to take off the capping course, the cornice, as it were, above the sculptures. So they damaged the building even more than just removing the sculptures themselves. Elgin took, again, legitimately or not is a question that we can debate ad infinitum. He took one of the caryatids from the Erechtheion North Porch, which stands in the British Museum today. He took some frieze slabs from the parapet of the Nike temple. He took about half of the surviving frieze and pedimental sculptures from the Parthenon, and this image shows you just one little tiny surviving bit of the pedimental sculpture, and then some of the in situ frieze. And he also took about he also took various bits and pieces from the Propylaea and other buildings up on the Acropolis. And then, just when you thought things had got as bad as they might, everything changed again. Because in 1821, 200 years ago this year, the Greeks rose up against the Ottoman Empire in their own War of Independence. And in 1830, a new Greek state was created. Think about it. So for the first time since Greece became a Roman province in the 2nd century BC, in 1830, the Greeks were in charge of their own country again, more or less, because they were under the protectorate of France, Britain, and Russia. But still, they had their own country again. So 2 years later, in 1832, the Bavarian Prince Otto of Wittelsbach accepted the throne of the new country, because, of course, in the 19th century, you couldn't have a country without a monarch. It's very fortunate that the proposal to turn the Acropolis into the Bavarian royal palace, which is what you see in the slide now, was never realized. This is a painting, a drawing by Carl Friedrich Schinkel, the German neoclassical architect who was actually commissioned to design a royal palace up on the Parthenon. Thankfully, that never happened. Nevertheless, it was German neoclassicism combined with the Philhellenism that was sweeping all through Europe in the early part of the 19th century that led to one of the first acts of the modern Greek state, which was to establish the Greek Archaeological Service. Now, the Acropolis would have been in a very, very sorry state in the 1830s. The houses in the Turkish village on top that had been bombarded during the war were reduced to rubble. The ancient buildings, one of which you see here, were bricked up, they were blasted, or they were completely missing altogether, like the small temple of Nike, the Athenian Nike, because that temple had been completely dismantled by the Turks and the stones used to build fortifications. A Bavarian guard was camped in the little mosque that occupied the middle of the Parthenon, and an officer who oversaw the surrender of the Turkish garrison there later wrote, and I'm quoting here, "I entered the Acropolis and witnessed the pell-mell of scattered marbles. In the midst of that confusion between capitals, broken pillars, small and large marble blocks, lay cannonballs, shell fragments, human skulls and bones." It must have been just a very sad place to be. In 1834, the Bavarian neoclassical architect Leo von Klenz visited Athens, and he proposed a series of measures for dealing with the Acropolis. He said that all post-classical accretions on top of the rock should come away, should be removed, and that all later fortifications, all the village houses and walls, anything that wasn't ancient, should be removed. He believed that the original ground level could be found and restored, and that the ancient blocks and fragments that were lying about all over the place should be gathered up and should be used to restore the ancient buildings. He basically wanted to turn the clock back to a kind of idealized 5th century BC golden age, like what you see on the screen now. He also advised, interestingly, because remember that this is the 1830s, right? Von Klenz said that infill material, when it was required to reconstruct buildings, should be of materials that could be visually understood as modern. So he felt that in any reconstruction, you shouldn't fake it, even in 1830. You shouldn't pretend that what is modern is actually ancient. Make it obvious. So it was von Klenz who decided that the Acropolis would be maintained as a romantic ruin. For the first time since the Neolithic period, the Acropolis would be unoccupied. In 1837, von Klenz's proposals were adopted by the newly formed Greek Archaeological Society, and they became guidelines for interventions on the Acropolis for the next 100 years. And I should point out that the Greek Archaeological Society and the Greek Archaeological Service were two separate bodies. And as you'll see, as in a moment, we'll see that the fact that the two of them existed, but very separately, sometimes caused problems. So the Archaeological Society decided to waste no time. This painting was made in 1835, only 5 years after the end of the war. And it records the start of the demolition of the Turkish bastions. In the foreground on the right, you can see the foundations of you can see the fragments from the Temple of Nike, Temple of Athena Nike. And on the left, you see the foundations of the building. And in this engraving from 1843, you can see the restoration of the Nike temple in progress on the sort of far right. The rebuilding of the Temple of Athena Nike was the very first reconstruction from the ground up of a classical monument in all of Europe. And these photographs, again from the Pitakis Museum in Athens, the photographs show the completed 19th century restoration. And you can see in the photograph on the right, above the solid wall, not the colonnade, you can see casts of 4 sculpted frieze blocks that were sent by the British Museum to replace the ones taken by Lord Elgin. And you can also see that limestone has been used to fill in the gaps in the walls, just as von Klenz intended. So it's very easy to differentiate the new stones from the ancient ones. So for 100 years, from the late 1830s to just before the start of the Second World War, 2 men were largely responsible for the repairs and restorations of the buildings on the Acropolis. Kyriakos Pitakis in the 19th century and Nikolaos Balanos in the 20th. Now, both of these men were passionate patriots and lovers of Greek antiquity. And because of that, they can be forgiven to some extent for what they did. But the damage that they inflicted on the ancient buildings is the clearest argument you need for doing absolutely nothing until you know that you're not doing any harm. Pitakis, who was head of the Greek Archaeological Service, excavated around the 4 main surviving buildings on the Acropolis. And in this photograph from around 1860, you can clearly see the piles of earth on the south side of the Acropolis from excavations that were carried out on top. Pitakis was determined that the sculpture that he was finding up on the top was not going to be carried off by collectors like Louis Favel, the French consul in Athens, which you see in this portrait. And you can see he's got a beautiful terrace with a view of the Acropolis, and one of the metopes from the Parthenon is leaning against the wall there. So at any rate, Pitakis was determined that this was not going to happen. So he arranged for the pieces he was finding to be stored in makeshift storerooms up on the Acropolis and elsewhere. But he was also very happy to display them to visitors in impromptu sort of galleries, as it were, in the Erechtheion and the Propylaea. See here. Pitakis restored parts of the Erechtheion, and this photograph is before the restoration. Including re-erecting in the south porch a cast of the Caryatid that had been carried off by Elgin, another gift from the British Museum. He restored some columns on the north side of the Parthenon colonnade. You see a couple of freestanding columns there. Those were reconstructed by Pitakis. And I just had to include this photograph because it absolutely terrifies me. Pitakis doesn't seem to have worried a great deal about health and safety, because if you look at this, if you can imagine this great heavy box camera on this very rickety platform that's being used to photograph the in situ frieze, it's just terrifying, but it's a fantastic picture. At any rate, he finished the restoration of the Nike temple, and he repaired the Roman steps leading up to the Propylaeum. But Pitakis made no serious attempt to determine the original position of any of the scattered remains when they were replaced in the walls. He didn't even care whether they came from the same building or not. And he also used new machine-made bricks to fill in gaps, as you see here, and to restore the original widths of walls. And if you look, the photograph on the right shows just an unbelievable Roman arch in the Parthenon on the west door. This is the kind of thing Pitakis was doing. After him, a series of other men oversaw the Acropolis for several decades, during which the site was cleared down to bedrock. This photograph shows it before the clearing. Anything that was still up there that was later than the 5th century BC was removed. The surface was then resurfaced to restore what was assumed to be the ground level as it was in the period of Pericles, using gravel and soil, that sort of thing. Then in 1894, an earthquake occurred, and it damaged the Parthenon and, to a lesser extent, some of the other buildings on the Acropolis. And it was decided that serious attention had to be paid to the monuments, and it needed to be grounded in science rather than merely a sort of patriotic affection for the site. So at the very end of the 19th century, a group called the Committee for the Conservation of the Acropolis was set up, which was intended to include not only Greek archaeologists, but also those from the foreign archaeological schools in Athens, as well as academics and other scientists. By this time, the British school, the American school, the French school, the German school, several others were well established in Athens. Okay, great. So far, so good. Unfortunately, Nikolaos Balanos, who held the position of engineer for public works, was invited to contribute to this committee, and he ended up taking control. He also ignored the stipulations of the committee because a different group, the Archaeological Society, was actually funding the work. And the Archaeological Society said he could do as he pleased. So he did. He carried on for the next 40 years until the start of the Second World War. Now, Balanos was trained as a civil engineer. He was not an archaeologist, and he ignored methods of interpretation and analysis that were common among archaeologists even by this time, by the turn of the 20th century. He had been authorized to do no more than carry out strengthening interventions on the Parthenon following the earthquake, but he actually went much further. He actively reconstructed parts of the Parthenon, and he used materials without any documentation or prior study. Balanos was mostly concerned with the aesthetics of the monuments. Now, to his credit, he did use Pentelic marble from the ancient quarries to replace missing parts. But he also did things like he installed a reinforced concrete lintel over the western door, which you see here, because he thought it matched the color of the ancient stone. He also used reinforced concrete to repair the colonnades at that end of the temple. Balanos eventually extended his activities to the other surviving buildings on the Acropolis. And like Pitakis, he used scattered stones, ancient stones, around the rock as a sort of common building material. He was unconcerned about whether or not they had originally been part of the building into which he was inserting them. And he even, and this is just makes my skin crawl, he even recarved ancient stones in order to create new ones like ceiling coffins, right? I mean, you just don't do this. In order to fit his new marble into gaps in the old stones, he would carve away the ancient stone rather than carving the new stone to fit the ancient stone. But worst of all, given his engineering expertise, were Balanos's technical failures, because it was these that would cause catastrophic damage to the buildings that he was meant to protect. Ancient Greek builders did not use mortar to join blocks. Instead, they joined them with iron ties that were set in lead to ensure that the iron didn't oxidize. Now, as a trained engineer, Balanos would have known that rusting iron will expand and it will crack the stone. But he used metal ties, iron ties, that were very poorly cast in lead, or sometimes not at all, like what you see on the top. So what this meant was that they rusted and they cracked the stone, which the photograph on the bottom shows. He also used a cement mortar without any consideration of whether it was an appropriate conservation material. He inserted large metal rods, plates, and even I-beams into the ancient stones in order to structurally support large areas of the buildings. And to do this, he had to carve out large amounts of that ancient material, so weakening the stone even more, even before the iron starts rusting and fractures the stone that remains. Now, there's no doubt that Balanos's restorations gave the ruined Acropolis back a lot of its grandeur. Those of you who may have seen it before the 1980s, like me, my first visit there was in 1978. Those of you who saw it before the 1980s will have seen Balanos's reconstructions, his restorations. And maybe like me, you fell in love with them. You fell in love with the whole effect. But in the 30 years between his last interventions in 1940 and around 1970, the buildings deteriorated. And acid rain from Athens' notorious air pollution was scouring the exposed stone. And I've dropped this slide in so that you can see on the horizon line the sort of gray, the sort of gray sky that is below the blue. That is the Athenian pollution. The Greeks refer to it as nephos, which means cloud, but it was horrible. It was not pleasant. In 1968, UNESCO declared that the situation on the Acropolis was urgent. And in 1975, the Greek state founded something called the Committee for the Conservation of the Acropolis Monuments, which is known by its acronym CCAM or CCAM. This would become the multidisciplinary and international scientific committee that the 19th century one failed to be. It would comprise archaeologists, architects, civil engineers, chemical engineers, conservators, and a myriad other specialists. And it's this committee, along with the Acropolis Restoration Service, that has been responsible for the interventions that have gone on now for more than a generation. CCAM characterized the damage to the buildings as mechanical, chemical, and biological. And those are explained in this slide. Now, chemical damage, we've just seen in the previous slide, the nephos that periodically coats Athens, even after 40 years of trying to clean up the air. Well, this is what happens to marble when it's exposed directly to acid rain. That is rainwater that is acidified by carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and nitrogen oxides. It dissolves. It erodes to a kind of sugar-like surface. These pictures show the effect of air pollution on the propylaea, the ones on the left. you see the black crusts that are under the cornice eaves and around the triglyphs and the guttae, the little sort of knobs that come that extend from the top. And in terms of biological damage, in the photograph on the right, you see above the capital that a weed has managed to take root in a joint. And so because marble is a type of limestone and plants love lime, this plant is going to be drawing nutrients out of the stone and damaging it over time. And you can also see in the photograph on the right rust from iron ties in the Balanos capital that is coating the upper part of the column. Mechanical damage, so that's chemical damage and biological damage. Mechanical damage isn't limited to that done by Balanos's iron insertions or Pitakis's bricks. There's also the destruction caused by fire during the Herulian sack at the end of the 3rd century, which we've already seen, and damage that's caused by everything from Roman repairs, Byzantine graffiti, which you see at the top right, and even the red-hot cannonballs that hit the buildings up on the Acropolis during the War of Independence. So Balanos and his predecessors made things worse, certainly, but they definitely weren't the first to harm the ancient buildings. The conservation of ancient monuments worldwide is governed by something called the International Charter of Venice. This is a set of principles that was originally drafted in 1931 and revised in 1966. Not every country signed up to the charter, but it has become very widely accepted. However, it's most relevant to medieval and later buildings. So during the drafting of plans for the Acropolis in the late 1970s, a proposal was published to add 5 articles to the Charter of Venice, specifically in reference to ancient monuments, and you see them here. Together with the original principles of the Charter, these articles constitute the philosophy that has dictated the modern interventions in Athens. Now, it's been said that the Acropolis monuments are near permanent creations, in contrast to any modern building which has obsolescence built in. And this fact alone, you would think, deserves the respect of, sorry about this. This fact deserves the respect of anyone who might meddle with these buildings. The interventions that have been carried out since the 1980s have all been done in the light of necessity and only following exhaustive historical and scientific research. In the Erechtheion, for example, some blocks that had been in their original ancient position above the north door, which you see in the photograph on the left, were dismantled because of fire damage and because some of the ancient ties had oxidized. But the interventions were not extended to the adjacent areas on either side of the door, despite the fact that there were some shifted joints there, and as a result, there were some broken ties, because it was decided that this damage was not critical for the structural behavior of the building. And extensive study determined that there was no progressive deterioration. And this limiting of intervention goes by a very technical term. It's called, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? So when structural restoration has been necessary, titanium ties are used now to secure blocks, along with purified Portland cement mortar. And in the photograph you see here, there are titanium ties on both the top and the bottom. And alongside the titanium tie on the top is an ancient Greek tie, with the ancient iron tie, which is still encased in its lead lead casing to keep it from oxidizing and keep it from rusting. And in the bottom photograph, you see a titanium tie with one of Balanos's metal ties, broken, iron ties, completely broken. Also, whenever new materials are inserted into gaps now, they are carved to fit the ancient stone. No damage is done to any ancient original material. And also, in the process of all of this work, all this restoration, some fantastic, amazing discoveries have been made. It wasn't all bad news. You know. The photographic documentation that was part and parcel of the restoration has revealed, for example, again, the amazing refinements of the Parthenon. The curvature of the stylobate, which you see here in a 19th century image, and then one from the 20th century. And this curvature, of course, is carried out in every single element of the building above it. There is not a single straight line in the Parthenon. It's amazing. We see again the entasis or swelling of the columns. The sort of like cigar shape of the columns, and you get little details like the almost imperceptible little band that was carved at the base of the bottommost column drums in the image on the right. And this was so, we think, so that in an earthquake, if something moved slightly, the bottom of the column drums wouldn't chip. We've seen the amazing survival of ancient decoration, like this unfinished Anthemian pattern in the east portico of the Propylaea. And these two fragments of painted decoration from the Parthenon, these were photographed in the 1960s, and they're now lost. But still, they do remind us that the buildings on the Acropolis were never pure, pristine white. They were all painted, and they were painted in colors that would probably seem rather garish to us today. The CCAM restorations have been going on for 46 years now. They're complete for the Temple of Athena Nike, which you see here, the Propylaea, the Erechtheion, the circuit walls around the rock, and various other minor remains on the Acropolis. Work on the Parthenon continues, and in 2019, it was decided that the north wall of the cella, that is the internal room in which the cult statue stood, that the north wall would be reconstructed. And you can see it there inside the colonnade. It's been estimated that this restoration will probably take about 15 years or so. Then, most recently, work has been carried out on the Acropolis to make it more accessible to disabled visitors. And this has involved laying reinforced concrete pathways across the site, one of which you see here. And possibly it's been proposed to restore part of the Roman staircase leading up to the Propylaea in order to enable more visitors to come up than the present ramp will allow. And if that is proved, then there may well be further changes and restorations done to the Propylaea itself. There has been some very, very loud and very strident criticism of these plans from a lot of people, from archaeologists and other scholars. I should say this laying out of the concrete was going on last winter and up until this spring. So anyone who goes up now will see it. There is also a lift that has been installed on the north side, kind of near the Erechtheion, and various other changes that have been made. As I say, a lot of people are very, very, very unhappy about these. They argue that the changes that are being done and that are being proposed go far beyond just restoration. They say that these are archaeologists as well as some other scientists and visitors themselves. They say that they're historically inaccurate, that they disregard the very protocols for historic preservation that the Venice Charter was set up to defend. So my question now is, does this sound familiar? Yes, it is. I said at the very beginning of this talk that we'd be looking at the way the Acropolis has changed. And as you can see, the story continues even as we speak. So only time will tell how well these latest interventions will go and how well they'll be accepted. But despite everything, the magic of the place still survives. And I personally have a flight booked to be there in October, and I just can't wait to get back. So I hope you enjoyed the lecture. I hope it's been informative. And I'm now going to go to, if I can find it, I'm going to go to questions. Oh, goodness, we've got lots of them. Right. Okay. Right. Some of them I can answer, some I'm going to have to pass on. The first one from Scott in Grapevine in the US would like to know, would like me to suggest some readings. What I would ask is that anyone can email me, and I will be happy to give you a list of both popular books and more sort of technically archaeological books for those who are interested. But I can't sort of, I'm trying to think of something right now and nothing is coming. Right. Right, what else? Karen from Richmond would like to know if the climb up to the Acropolis is difficult. She says, we're active seniors, but we may need some extra time. You'll be fine. You'll be fine. There are places where it gets narrow, and if you end up with a crowd of teenagers behind you, it will be a bit like the parting of the Red Sea. I mean, they'll just go around you, but you won't. There are lots of steps, but you just take your time and you'll get up there and it'll be fine. Margarita of Weehawken, Weehawken, it sounds like somewhere in Wisconsin, right? Asks whether there are other major historical sites in Greece that are being restored at this time. This is the Acropolis is the main one right now. There are small-scale interventions that go on all the time on sites, throughout the country. But most of these are conservation, and there's a kind of hand-holding between conservation and restoration. Sometimes in the process of conservation, restoration is done because that's the best way to conserve the ancient buildings or the ancient material. At other times, it's simply conservation with no attempt to restore anything. I can't think of anything off the top of my head that is major that is going on at the moment. But as I said, if you look around, there are things going on most sites most of the time. Let's see, what's a good right. What items are right? Vicky from Conroe asks, when items were taken early on from the Acropolis, where were they taken to? A museum. That's a very good question. There was a lot of treasure hunting going on in the early years, particularly after the restoration of the Greek state in 1830 and before. And a lot of the material ended up in museums around Europe. Even in America, there are objects from the Acropolis in the Met Museum, in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, for example, in New York. The British Museum has a lot, of course, which was taken by Elgin and then eventually sold by him to the British Museum. There are things in the Louvre. Part of the frieze from the Acropolis, from the Parthenon, is actually in the Louvre. So there's a mixture. But the best place, of course, to see all of this, to see any of this, is at the Acropolis Museum itself in Athens. Brand new museum, beautiful. If you go up to the top floor, which is where the frieze, the frieze and the metopes, the sculptures from the Parthenon are reconstructed, or sort of reconstructed there. If you haven't been up there, it's beautiful because you get a view of the Parthenon itself from the floor to ceiling windows, and the building itself has been built to be at on the same axis as the Parthenon. So it's like a sort of kind of like a mirror image. Right. Speak briefly. Can you speak briefly? Can you speak briefly of the surviving Mycenaean foundations on the Acropolis? Well, my specialty is actually Bronze Age, the Bronze Age Aegean. So I find the Mycenaean remains there fascinating. There is very little to see at the moment. There are bits of the surrounding wall, sort of at the southwest corner of the Acropolis, of the Parthenon. There are some bits of Bronze Age wall. It's assumed that the Mycenaean palace was more or less in the center, and some stones have been attributed to it. And that would have been in the area around what's called the old Parthenon, that not the pre-Periclean Parthenon, but one even older than that in the middle. But there's very, very little to see there now. How does a building? This is a very good question from Jim in Sugar Mountain. How does a building made of entirely stone burn? It had a lot of wood, because when you think about it, all of the rafters were wood, the ceilings were wood. They would have the marble coffers that formed the ceiling that you would have looked up to see were actually attached to wooden beams. So all you had to do was set fire to the roof, basically, and the whole thing would crumble. That's the case with all ancient buildings. They did use a lot of wood, despite the fact that the walls, the columns, and in the case of the Parthenon, the roof itself was marble. Right. How do you feel about, this is a good question. How do you feel about the restoration that was done at Knossos from Philippa? That's difficult. You have to, it's a bit like what's happening on the Acropolis now, what's been happening over the winter. You have to balance accessibility and the fact that many, many, many more people are visiting ancient sites today than they used to, with preservation of the site itself. When I was a student at Knossos, you could go anywhere. And I miss the fact that you can't do that anymore. You have to follow a path around the site. But on the other hand, I accept that the Acropolis, which gets 5 million visitors a year, needs to be preserved. And Knossos, which gets, I think, something like 2.5 million a year, would simply dissolve under that many feet. So they have to do it. Whether it could have been done a bit more aesthetically, you could argue about that forever. Right? And here's the question that I knew was going to come up from Sam from Palos Verdes Estates. Do you think the Elgin marbles should be returned? This is a question that is a really good one if you're on a ship, because then you can repair to the bar, get yourself a drink, and argue until midnight about this. I probably shouldn't say one way or another. I feel that the Greeks care very, very, very much about their heritage, and they have a passionate desire to bring it home, and I can understand that. On the other hand, I can understand that there are legalities concerned in terms of the British Museum that make that difficult. We'll see. We'll see what happens. Yeah. Right. We'll give it another. We'll do a few more questions. I don't want to keep you too long. Will they ever? Let's see. No, this is a good question from Violetta from Columbus. Concerning the criticisms about the work on accessibility, shouldn't a monument that symbolizes democracy itself be accessible to as many people as possible? That's a very good argument for doing it. Yes, that's a very good argument. There are those who have said that by doing these sorts of things, by making these latest interventions, that the Acropolis, the people in charge of the Acropolis are pandering to mass tourism, and that we should not have as many people up there as are going up now, and more. On the other hand, you make a very good point. I mean, the Acropolis was accessible to anybody in ancient Greece. There was no limit, and why shouldn't it be accessible now to anyone who wants to go up? Well, that's not a bad idea. Yeah. Is the Acropolis Museum open? From Robert in Boulder. Is there anything in it? The Acropolis Museum is definitely open, and it's got amazing collections. So do go. It's worth it. It's definitely worth it. Also, I should say, when you go to the Acropolis Museum, there's all the stuff inside, which is amazing. It's on sort of 5 or 6 floors. The top floor of which is this sort of footprint of the Parthenon itself, with casts where they exist, with casts where the sculptures are in other museums like the Louvre or the British Museum, and then the actual sculptures where they still survive there in Greece. But underneath, and this is what's amazing, underneath they have excavated the remains of the Greek neighborhood, a 5th century Greek neighborhood with houses and sewers and things like that. And so after you see the museum itself, go around the back. You sort of go around the side, and your ticket allows you to go to both of them. And you go actually underneath the museum, which is built on stilts, and you get to see this amazing excavation of a sort of Greek neighborhood, an Athenian neighborhood. It's wonderful. When St. Paul preached in Athens in the 1st century AD, did he preach on the Acropolis? This is from Jeff in Chicago. I don't know. I don't know. Right. What else? We keep getting more and more and more coming in. Let's see. During previous, this is from Carol in Burlington. During previous visits to Athens, I appreciated the clear sheets on sidewalks and the entrance to the Parthenon Museum, which revealed the excavations below the surface level. That's where you can actually go down now and walk among those ruins. Will future restoration include such visual access without damaging the original architecture? I think so. I think so. Yeah. I mean, when you go into the museum itself now, there are these thick glass plates that you walk over in order to see what's below. If you like me don't like being suspended over things, you sort of go around the sides of them. Right. Anything else? Let's see if there are any other good questions. There are several questions about the Elgin Marbles, and there's one wondering whether the British government will release the marbles and return them. You know, I should point out that it's not a matter for the British government. It is a matter for the trustees of the British Museum, which are completely separate, and they have a charter that says that, I'm not sure, but it says something like that objects that are in the museum cannot be deaccessioned without a great deal of trouble. And this has been used as a reason for not returning them. There are other reasons as well. There's the fact that the British Museum now refers to itself as a world museum, and it would be, I mean, it would be a shame if the only place you could see Greek things was in Greece, and the only place you could see Nigerian things was in Nigeria, and the only place to see American things was in America, because people can't always access them. So in a sense, the idea of a world museum collecting things so that people in a given place can be exposed to objects from places that they may never see is a good one. But on the other hand, you can understand the Greeks wanting things back. I do have to say that it isn't a matter for the British government. It is the British Museum that will decide. Okay, I think we've got maybe 3 more minutes. Any other good questions? When did the Athena Promachos statue disappear? I ask as the image of the proposed Bavarian palace that you showed shows the statue. That was imaginary. We don't know when the Promachos actually disappeared, but it would have been in antiquity. So it certainly wasn't around when in the 19th century when that painting was made. We know what it looks like. We have an idea of what it looked like because of coins and small statuettes, but it would have been melted down in antiquity. I think, right, what is my email? I'm not sure whether I'm meant to give this out now or whether it goes through Viking. I think I will, if you contact Viking, I think they will pass on my email rather than my giving it out now. And I think that's pretty much it. And those were very good questions. Thank you very much again for coming, for your attention. It's been very bizarre knowing that you can see me, but I can't see you. But there it is. It's been a very interesting experience. Anyway, I hope you all get to Athens, to Greece and to Athens as soon as possible. The Greeks need tourism, so do go if you can, and stay safe. And I hope I'm going to be there in October. All right. Thank you very, very much. All right. Goodbye.